Hi guys, welcome to another video on Ubuntu May. This is part of the series of me trying to create a foundation for my decolonization series. The last one we talked about what, who, where, and when, and this one is going to be mostly focused on the how. How did this take place? Which methods were used? The strategies that impact the processes and so on. I talk about these things not as just like let's take a stroll down memory lane, but through the belief as an African person and my indigenous belief in time frame, which that time is secular and that the past, the present, and the future are all connected. And me as a person, just like plants, this plant over here, we are all a collection of the past, and I live today as testimony of my ancestors, from their strength, their wisdom, their empowerment, and then building on that for myself by understanding them to create a better future for ourselves as well. So these things for me are important as an individual, but also I think for us as a people to understand how did colonization take place. I can of course not talk about everything, but I hope to encourage or to inspire and curiosity within you, and for you, like wherever you come from. Like I said in my last video, colonization took place in many different countries, so a lot of us are influenced by it, and so we need to understand how did these things affect our ancestors, because in a way by understanding them we understand ourselves. By fighting justice for them, by the way we live our lives and what we support and how we speak up, we do that for them as well. Okay, so the process and impact of colonization. There are three main things I'll talk about in this video, which is of course wars and genocide, which was a big part of how colonization took place. Also, then I'll go on to speak about cultural genocide and the strategy, of course, of divide and conquer. While in school, we learned often that the people that went on colonizing missions, there was a need to perceive them as adventurers, you know, as explorers. All these actions were not really actions to be proud of. One of them was, of course, mass genocide, which was an important part of controlling the native people, or at least decreasing the amount of people that were on countries in order for them to be ruled. For example, what the Europeans did to the Native Americans and what they did to South Africa was a great inspiration for Hitler later on. Hitler's concept of concentration camps as well as the practicability of genocide owed much, so he claimed, to his studies of English and United States history. He admired the camps for Boer prisoners in South Africa and for the Indians in the Wild West, and often praised to his inner circle the efficiency of America's extermination by starvation and uneven combat of the red savages who could not be tamed by captivity. For example, in the USA, the making of USA, millions of natives were slaughtered and massacred by any means necessary. The biggest killers, though, were smallpox, measles, influenza, whooping cough, typhus, cholera, and scarlet fever, all imported by the European colonists. Now, I went into researching more about why was it that there were more diseases that affected the natives more than the other way around, or at least like both of them at the same time. And one reason is that the Europeans used to live in more crowded, bigger cities in which like diseases travel around, and also because of Eurasia, because technically Europe isn't a continent, it is kind of like a part of Eurasia, right? But they made that up because, you know, exceptionalism. But yeah. So when you look at Eurasia, so they were also trading with Asia, and diseases were passed on, you know, back and forth, and so the immune systems of the Europeans were used to all these diseases that they were constantly surrounded by. But in a lot of indigenous countries, people did not live very closely together. But not only that, the way they lived maybe had different diseases that were not as harmful because of the sanitation they practiced, because of the way they lived with nature. Whereas in Europe, people had become urbanized more than in other places where people lived more spread out in smaller communities or tribes, which tend to be more healthier in that sense. Or even if there was a disease, it would maybe like only affect a small amount of people, not everybody. So diseases was a big part of how people died. It was also the abusing of trust that some natives showed the invaders, which because maybe of the way they saw the world, because I also believe that it's often so that we believe the worst of people when we also are capable of the worst, in that sense that like a criminal thinks everybody's a criminal and so on. And if you don't know all the measures of warfare that other people are willing to take, you might be more trusting than they are. This is also similar to what the Aborigines experienced at the arrival of the British. The diseases the British brought with them were just as lethal at killing the Aborigines as their own violent. efforts. Between 1788 and 1900, the Aboriginal had decreased by 90%. A letter from one witness read, "In less than 20 years, we have nearly swept them off the face of the earth. We have shot them down like dogs in the guise of friendship. We have made them drunkards and infected them with diseases which have rotted the bones of their adults, and made such few children as are born amongst them a sorrow and a torture from the very instance of their birth. We have made them outcasts on their own land, and are rapidly consigning them to entire annihilation." Also, what was interesting about this is that biological warfare might sound very conspiracy theory today, but it was actually something that was quite common then. And if it was common then, I think it would be silly to think, but that was back then, because a lot of things continue to happen today and we just brush them off as that's just coincidence. Nobody would do that. But we really have to understand, was there such an effort to make sure stuff like this would never happen? So in terms of biological warfare, there is a quote that says, "It is evident that the British had few qualms about the tactic of affecting the general population as well as the enemy army with smallpox." In 1777, a British officer, Robert Duncan, published in New York a little book entitled Military Collections and Remarks. In footnote, he offered suggestions. Dip arrows in the matter of smallpox and twang them at the American rebels in order to inoculate them. This would sooner disband the stubborn, ignorant, enthusiastic savages than any other compulsive measures, such as their dread and fear of that disorder. So they knew that they had a weakness, of course, to do foreign diseases that they had not experienced, and they were willing to use this as a means to kill them as quick as possible. It's also similar to what happened in the USA, where the natives were given blankets infected with smallpox to kill. So the measures were kind of similar in most of the places. Like, there was ruthless and no empathy, because first of all, it was important to show that these were savages. These are not people like you and I, because we would treat them better. And that would mean that, of course, if that was true, that if there had been people that would have been treated better, we would assume that Europe actually was a utopia for all humans, all European humans, but it still wasn't. There was the feudal system that subjugated a lot of the underclass, and I also think that, in a way, because these armies and the people that were sent away were often also people who came from the underclass, to get an experience, an opportunity to be on the upper hand, to have a superior complex finally, and to feel like you are worth more. I think that also made the instincts even more cruel. Not that, of course, the upper class wouldn't have done the same, because often the missions were also supported and maintained by them, but I'm just saying that the workforce were people who in their own country didn't have a lot of power maybe, and perhaps that contributed to how sadistic their practices were. And also sometimes, like in Australia, I read an account where they would, of course, through friendliness, a lot of these, like I said, are very sadistic. Like, they would offer food to starving natives, and of course they would put poison in the food. So they would offer it to people, families, whatever, and they would eat it and all die. You know, it's just, in Africa you had King Leopold, a Belgian colonizer under the guise of scientific research and charity work. He killed around 11 and 15 million Congolese. He was a sadistic ruler, but obviously he didn't carry out all the killings himself. He had armies who worked for him during his rule. During his rule, terror and terrorism was a huge part of how he maintained his power. One account reads, "One time a steamer pulled up to a river town. When the people came out to greet the boat as expected, the soldiers on board leveled their guns and opened fire, shooting down men, women, and children. They took those who lived as prisoners to work on plantation. The officers fought over who would get the best looking women." So obviously also rape was a big part of this. And it was just savageness, like pure savageness. And I wonder sometimes, like, why was it that there are even any accounts of them being met with kindness? If it was innate with all people to fear other people, you know, but yet there are many stories of how they were welcomed by native people. They were even shown and even saved and shown how to take up the land, only always to be taken advantage of and then finally exploited, killed, murdered, and so on, right? So there was a difference in the way the two people, the two races, the different races thought about the world or each other, or strangers in that sense. And it's quite interesting to read about that and wonder about those things, because if on these native countries, native lands, if they were also constantly fighting and into battle and fearing strangers, they would have been attacked wherever they went as the first impact. Like we see you attack. If this was just everywhere in the world, that everyone was just hostile, hating each other, fighting each other, all tribes were against each other. So if I can fight my brother who looks like me, and this is before European brainwashing, why wouldn't I fight a stranger that looks nothing like me as soon as I see them? So when you read accounts of people coming out to greet them, I wonder why is that. But some of the accounts also tell of how in the beginning they might come with gifts because that was a way to let them inside. Like for example, in the case of India, they came in as business people in the beginning because India was still ruled by the Mongol Empire. But then once they learned the structure of the country, they then changed and switched up and say, hey, we want your country and you guys are going to be subject. There were also other genocides, of course, that took place that you can read about. I didn't want to talk too much about genocides because the more you read about, the more depressing they are. If you want, obviously you should research more of them. Even though I'm talking about how colonization took place, people didn't just let it happen from the Aboriginals to the Native Americans to Mexico, South America in general, the Caribbeans, to Africa. People fought back, but like I mentioned before, that maybe they had never spent enough time analyzing their new enemy, or as much investing in advanced warfare as their enemies had. In many of those conflicts or wars or uprising, the odds were not in their favor, unfortunately. But that is not to discourage you, because people kept fighting, and the fact that we are still alive today shows that we did not lose completely. We were not annihilated. Our people still exist, and because we live on as their children, as our offspring, we still have the power to continue resisting and growing and unlearning all this stuff and reclaiming our existence and reclaiming our right to be on this planet as well. So don't be discouraged. And then there was also the divide and conquer method. The elements of this technique involved creating or encouraging divisions among the subjects to prevent alliance that could challenge the sovereign, aiding and promoting those who are willing to cooperate with the sovereign, fostering distrust and anonymity between local rulers, encouraging meaningless expenditures that reduce the capability for political and military spending. During all this, it was important for the British, for example, in Africa, but also other colonizers in the different continents, to first study the people, see which tribes were against each other, and also to pick one favorite tribe over another. And then you use the people you have chosen as superior to fight for you. One example, for example, India, there were kingdoms that were naturally like they had bickerings or fightings against each other. And so this made it easier for the British to align themselves with one kingdom to fight the second kingdom. Then once that kingdom was destroyed, then the British would turn on the kingdom they had aligned themselves with. And these, of course, have huge impact on the people afterwards, even post-colonialism, because these people still have to live together. And once you've turned people against each other and made them distrust each other, made them hate each other, and then you say, well, I don't understand why the savages are always having wars in their countries, without understanding how this was actually a tactic used during colonialism. And we also are to blame for that, because we need to learn these things and know these are techniques that are used to make us each other's enemies, right? And we shouldn't be that. Anyway, so for example, in Kenya, in their colonial conquest, the British followed a policy of divide and conquer, allying with some African groups against others. The Maasai were one group with whom the British allied in order to impose their rule. To aid colonial administration, the British divided Kenyans into ethnic classifications based on linguistic variations and locality. Thus, specific ethnic subgroups called tribes were created in a form that had not existed previously. The ethnic groups were assigned to live in separate areas of the colony. Within each subgroup, colonial administration designed one chief who became responsible for collecting taxes levied by the colonial state. So that was what happened in Kenya. In Rwanda, for example, over the course of European occupation in Rwanda, elitism was successfully refashioned into racism. By preventing Hutu access to higher education and administrative jobs, they were essentially closed off from the political arena, representation in such. Moreover, the documentation of ethnic groups enhanced the importance of these rigid classifications. No longer was there flexibility between groups. Ethnic boundaries were clearly defined, so Hutu excommunicated from power experienced the solidarity of the oppressed. Over time, this pronounced separateness between Hutu and Tutsi blossomed into hatred. And we all know how that developed during the wars, because when we talked about the genocide in Rwanda, people seldom connect that part to it and where did this hatred came. Nothing falls from the sky. Everything is always in the making, and you need to change the way people feel and think and see each other and themselves before you can get them to act a certain way. So the Europeans, in this sense, of course, knowing that, they knew that if they could get the people in the country to be more focused on fighting each other, they would have less time to come together united and fight the Europeans instead. In Uganda, for example, my own country, the same strategy of divide and conquer was used. It was the Baganda tribe who got to play favorite child. However, the real conflict in Uganda emerges from the British system of indirect rule, which favored the kingdom of Buganda due to its predominant exposure to Christianity. Also, in line with British ideas of social Darwinism and racial science, Baganda was favored as it had a more advanced system of political organization than other kingdoms of the area. In the divide and rule strategy, the British exported the Ganda political system to other areas and popped up Baganda agents throughout the protectorate. Indeed, the Baganda became the cruel arm of the British. And this is a very important part. And this caused, of course, great resentment within my country as well, because you use the people themselves to oppress each other. During slavery, for example, in America, it was often that slave masters, instead of like punishing the slaves themselves, would take another slave to punish the slave. And this creates animosity, because when the slave master goes back to his house and his family and so on, these people, the slaves, had to still sleep in the same compounds, maybe in the same house. And it created a rift where people should be unified and working together to fight that common evil. And by making them focus more on the hatred they had against each other, the British or the Europeans in these countries, to go on with their own mission, because nobody was paying them no mind, right? And this is a very big part of the US-centric worldview, is to define differences, classify differences, and then put them against each other. So divide and conquer was actually part of their own worldview, in that things that are different should be put and classified, especially with Darwinism coming into play, that some things are better than others, and therefore if there are differences, we must classify them by what is better and what is worse. Whereas in many places, people had different languages, they spoke different languages, had different religions or even spiritualities, but still could live amongst each other without problems. And when the British, especially in India, seeing this mixed pot of different people, not that there were no conflicts at all, there were conflicts. That's why they were also able to use the small conflicts and expand them to bigger conflicts, so that these people were more focused on fighting each other than, of course, their common enemy. Then there was also the cultural genocide, of course, destroying artifacts, scriptures, cultural symbols, languages, spirituality. In this phase, you are destroying the home, physical and mental state of the natives. And it's easier to program and to control people in a state of helplessness than when they are empowered and they have their languages, their cultures, and who they are, their identity. So it's important to strip it entirely away. And if you are a colonizer, of course, in order to replace it and substitute it with your own. So whatever they took away, they replaced with their own religion. That's how a lot of countries that became Christians. And I always find it interesting how in the current days, like Europe fears the invasion of Muslims, because maybe, like I say, we are our ancestors. Maybe there is a sense in them that what if they do to us what we did to them? The destroying of culture is quite important. Also, you have a famous black scholar, I can't remember her name, but she's female, and she once said that the culture tradition of a people is their immune system. So by destroying the cultures and traditions of people, it's easy for them, because they're weak, to implement your own ideas of the world, your own ideas of how they should be. So yeah, guys, those are the three main places I wanted to talk about, and also to bring awareness. And then after all this, of course, we are going to go in the next one, the destruction of nature and spirituality. And the last one will be on the psychological effects that we now live with because of that, because I think that's a very important part to talk about when we talk about decolonization, is the psychological effects of colonization that we have inherited through our new culture, new languages, new ways of being and identifying because of colonization. And please do share, like, if you come from countries that also were formerly colonized, like if you have any more insights. I'll try to leave most of what I read out loud, of course, like the links to those passages, but otherwise I'll see you obviously in my next video, guys. Bye. That one, because again, as colonized people, we also have those tendencies to adopt ideas, customs, practices that are particular to the colonies that colonized us.